Hi there. One of the most common reasons people tell me they don't want to buy a Kindle is because it costs way too much money when you compare it to an iPad, which does the same thing as a Kindle. It can read books, but it also does so much more. Now, yes, that is definitely true. Buying an iPad will give you a lot more functionality than a Kindle ever will. But in this video, I'm going to give you a few reasons why I think it's worth paying more money for a Kindle, even though it can do less things functionally speaking, and why reading on an iPad may not be the best idea. Now, the first reason why buying a Kindle is better than buying an iPad is all about distractions. Let me explain what I mean by that. How many times have you gone to your iPad or your phone with a very specific intention of reading in the Kindle app or looking at some blogs or whatever it might be, then all of a sudden an alert comes up or a message comes in and you go down this rabbit hole of doing something completely different than what you expected to be doing, and you completely forget what your original intent was. This happens to me more often than not, and what's even worse is sometimes I do make it into my Kindle app or my Read It Later app, and by the time I start reading something, I get a message that comes in while I'm reading and that interrupts my flow, and I get distracted and my mind starts wandering. It's just a mess of distractions. Now, yes, iPads do have the feature of do not disturb, and you do have something called focus modes that definitely do help, but chances are you're not going to have D&D turned on all the time. And even when you're reading in the Kindle app and you have that turned on, that temptation of closing the app and doing something else will always be there tempting you. This is especially problematic because reading can sometimes be much less appealing than browsing YouTube videos or TikTok shorts, whatever it might be. Reading does require a bit of discipline, and if you're in a lazy mood and you're on your iPad, you might be tempted to go look at something else instead of reading something that you wanted to do. On a Kindle, there's no other apps or distractions to take you away from reading. Actually, now that I think about it, that's actually a lie. There is a web browser built into the Kindle if you want to use that to browse the web, but this web browser will be the last web browser you'll ever want to use. It is the most clunky experience ever. So even though there is a web browser in here, you'll never want to use it. The Kindle is really designed for one purpose only, and that is for reading books. There is no other distraction on this device. When I pick up my Kindle, my only intent is to read a book, and the best part about it is I don't have to worry about alerts coming up or messages, phone calls, whatever it might be coming in at the most random times. That temptation of switching apps is just not there completely. So having a Kindle completely removes all of those distractions that you get on a device like an iPad. Moving on to reason number 2 of why reading on a Kindle is better than reading on an iPad, it's all about having a dedicated reading device. Earlier this year, me and people in the book club that I'm part of called Presently Reading read a book called Atomic Habits. This book is really, really great, but there's one lesson that really stood out to me, and that's the idea of optimizing your environment. When it comes to building new habits, like building a reading habit, you really want to optimize your environment to encourage it. And the way a Kindle does that is you only have one intention of using this device, and that's to read a book. For me, I actually have multiple Kindles. I have one by my bedside, one in my living room for my morning prayers, and one in my backpack. So whenever I want to read, my environment always supports that habit. I have a Kindle within arm's reach everywhere I go. Now imagine for a second that instead of my Kindle, I used an iPad to optimize my environment to encourage a reading habit. It wouldn't encourage a reading habit at all. Imagine having an iPad next to my bed before going to sleep. The chances of me actually reading anything on there are very, very little. I would probably get distracted by the other apps like we talked about before and not read anything at all. Whereas on my Kindle, the only thing I can do on here is read, and having one right next to my bed really does encourage me to read just for a few minutes every single night. It makes such a big difference. In the book, the author James Clear really does encourage this idea of having a dedicated space for every habit that you do. Having a dedicated space for your work, which means don't work in bed, using your bed only for sleeping, only using your desk for working, only using your living room sofa for hanging out and watching TV, whatever it might be, only having one purpose for everything in your home. The same can be applied to your devices. Having a dedicated device for reading makes it so much more likely that you're going to follow through with that habit and not get it mixed up with anything else. The third reason I want to talk about is all about our eyes. Now you may be wondering, why in the world would I be comparing an iPad screen to a Kindle screen? The iPad screen is clearly much better in technology. It's a color screen. The contrast is so nice. It looks so crispy when you read text on it. And of course, the brightness is so much nicer than a Kindle. And you also have that warm light, temperature control. How does it even compare compare to a black and white Kindle screen. The problem with screens like your phone or an iPad is when you read on them for a long period of time, you're really going to feel the impact of that on your eyes. This is because when you're reading text, you're putting a lot of focus on small characters on a screen, and you're going through the text line by line, and you're really putting a lot of attention into that. When you're watching a movie or a YouTube video, your eyes aren't focusing like that in the same way, so you can watch those just fine. But when you're reading on an iPad screen, you're really putting a lot of strain on a bright display. Now, don't get me wrong, you can probably read on an iPad or iPhone screen just fine for a long period of time, but if you read at night especially, or just over a long period of time, you are gonna feel the effects of it in the long term. On a Kindle, we have a whole different technology being used called e-ink. It is nothing like reading on an iPad. The goal of a Kindle screen is to replicate reading on real paper. That is why it is black and white. There's no need for that crazy display of LEDs. It's just a simple screen with the bare essentials to read crispy text. Oftentimes when reading on my Kindle, I forget completely that it's a Kindle. I just think it's a real book because it feels like reading on paper. It has that 300 ppi resolution for that high crispy text display that you really need for reading books. Then also you have things like a display that has warm light temperature control and brightness. So you have all the essential features that you need, but you are missing out on some of the fancy things the iPad has. The one thing that the Kindle has though is something called a front lit display. Now on an iPad, all the LEDs are being lit from the back of the display into your eyes. With the Kindle, it's very, very different. The way it's lighting up the screen is actually shining LEDs from the front of the screen onto the display, almost like a reading lamp going onto a piece of paper, but all happening underneath one piece of glass on the Kindle. It's actually so much better for your eyes because the LEDs aren't shining directly into your face. They're only being shined onto the Kindle screen on the inside. Now, full disclaimer here, I am not an expert on this technology or eye studies or anything like that. I'm just speaking from my personal experience. I am sure there are cases for reading on an iPad that make it a worthwhile experience, but from my personal point of view, I think reading on a Kindle just works so much nicer and it just feels much more comfortable. Now, the fourth reason why I think buying a Kindle is a better idea than buying an iPad for reading books is water resistance. And when you buy an iPad, these devices are very, very fragile. You don't want to break them or get them wet. They are not water resistant. With the Kindle, these devices are actually a lot more durable and they're even water resistant. Now look, I don't read in the bathtub, I don't read in the pool, I don't read on the beach. I actually did that once, but not by the water. So it's not something I do very often, but there have been a couple times where I've been drinking some water at my desk and a few drops of water got onto my Kindle, and I just remember that it's water resistant. I don't have to worry about it. It just feels a lot more durable than using an iPad, so I can bring my Kindle around anywhere I want and not have to worry about protecting it so much. It has some durability to it. Now, the final reason I have for getting an iPad over a Kindle is if you travel a lot, I really think Kindles are a more portable device than an iPad. Now, iPads and Kindles are both built for portability, and iPads especially are all about portability. You can bring them anywhere you want, but when it comes to actually using them in a travel environment when you're moving out and about, I find myself using a Kindle way more than I ever would if I had an iPad in my backpack. First of all, when I pack an iPad into my backpack, it has to go into a dedicated pocket right next to my laptop. It takes up quite a bit of space. I have to be a little bit careful to make sure nothing hits up against it. It's a fragile device. I don't want other things in my bag hitting my iPad or my laptop. Now, when you compare that to my Kindle, this device actually doesn't have to go in that dedicated pocket. It can fit in smaller pockets inside my backpack alongside things like my gum or my chargers. It just fits in smaller pockets, which surprisingly has become a very useful thing for me whenever I go commuting to my office. Now, on YouTube, I've even gotten comments from people telling me their Kindle fits in their pocket. Now, I haven't tried that myself. Let me give it a shot right now. And surprisingly, it does fit pretty well, and it goes right next to my phone, and no hands right here, it's in my pocket right now. So it does work, but I don't think I'd ever do this in public. But the fact of the matter is, I would never do this with an iPad. I would never shove an iPad in my pocket like I do with my phone. So the portability on a Kindle and the durability of a Kindle for traveling is way, way more than an iPad. One more thing that's really worth mentioning about travel is how it feels reading in public on an iPad versus a Kindle. Every single day I go to New York City, I take the subway, and I use a Kindle to read my books. This is because it feels very inconspicuous, it's not very obvious, it doesn't get in people's faces, no one really can tell I'm reading on a device that has technology on it. It just feels like pulling out a book and reading on it. Whereas if I pulled out an iPad, for example, immediately people around me are going to tell I have a tablet in my hands, it's a shining screen, it draws attention, and people know what it is. And I don't like drawing attention to expensive devices while I'm traveling in public. So it's definitely one point to note. If you commute a lot on public transit, reading on a Kindle is much less obvious than reading on an iPad. Now, those are my reasons comparing Kindles to iPads, but there's a whole other topic that you probably want to watch if you enjoyed this video, and that's comparing Kindles to physical books and seeing which one comes up on top. I have a whole video dedicated to that topic, link for that on the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.